Richard bowing in. Good morning, everyone. I'm always delighted to see your faces and to be together with you in this online platform, just as I'm always happy to see you when we can gather in person. And I want to thank Elena and Craig for the invitation to participate today, and both Jeff and John for their wonderful comments and thoughts. So when Elena contacted me, she asked if I might talk about precepts and vow from the perspective of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. For those of you that don't know me, by the way, my name is Richard. I'm a member of the Connecticut Dharma Teacher or Connecticut branch of the Dharma Teacher organization. I think given the wonderful attention that was given to the precepts earlier, I'm going to go in a somewhat different direction and talk a little bit about the Bodhisattva vow. I have been practicing in the Tibetan tradition for about 8 years, and it was just recently I got around to formally taking my Bodhisattva vow through Tibetan lineage. But I had taken it many years before through the founder of our organization, Venerable Thich Trì Huang. So in our tradition, that is the one we inherited through Tay, typically one formally enters the Buddhist path by taking the precepts and the 3 refuges. And then several years later, the way Tay has organized it, those of us that commit to becoming teachers and become ordained to teach, the Bodhisattva vow is part of that ceremony. And Jeff alluded to a few of these before, but in our Vietnamese Zen lineage, the vows would go like this. And we are encouraged to say them daily. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Dharma teachings are boundless. I vow to master them. And the Buddha's awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to attain it. And admittedly, it's very aspirational language. But why do I mention having taken the Bodhisattva vows earlier with Tay through the Dharma Teacher organization? Several years after I had ordained, I asked Tay about how he would feel about me branching off and doing some studies in other traditions. And I was very, very grateful for his answer. Without missing a beat, Tay said to me, well, Richard, remember your 3rd Bodhisattva vow. And I kind of ran through them in my head, got to the 3rd one. Dharma teachings are boundless, I vow to master them, or more aspirationally, to master them all. So in other words, he was giving me his blessing to go study other traditions. And eventually that did involve, these days I practice with two sanghas in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. In order to give some order to my thoughts and comments here, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the ceremony in one of the Tibetan lineages that I practice in. It involves 3 parts. There's a preliminary part, which involves the 7-limb or 7-branch prayer, which is very sacred to Tibetan Buddhists and will often be have a prominent role in their ceremonies. I think many of the elements to this seven branch prayer would be familiar to people in other Buddhist traditions as well. So the seven branches or elements to this prayer are prostrations, offerings to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, confession of one's obscurations or cognitive and emotional afflictions. I think the first three orient us toward humility and letting go of ego clinging. Branches or elements 4, 5, 6, and 7 involve rejoicing in being's merit, asking teachers to share the Dharma with us and to remain present on this earth in order to be available to share the Dharma with us. And then number 7 is simply dedicating the merit of our activities for the benefit of all beings. And I think collectively we could kind of distill these 4 branches by saying they promote a sense of connection and touching into something bigger than ourselves, and also promote a sense of gratitude. At least that's how I've experienced these elements of the 7-branch prayer. The next part of the ceremony is the main part of the ceremony, and this involves actually taking the Bodhisattva vow. And there's at least 2 important components to this. The first one is taking refuge. I'm sure most of the people attending today are familiar with the refuge. We did it at the beginning of today's gathering. So taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. In the Tibetan tradition, they will sometimes break the refuges out into outer, inner, and innermost refuges. And I'll just share a little bit about the so-called inner refuge. So the inner refuge sort of extends the commitment we make with the outer refuges in this way. So the inner refuge in taking the Buddha is a refuge recognizes that all of us have the potential to achieve the awakening that the Buddha did. Okay, depending on what traditions you practice in, terms that come to mind are acknowledging your own innermost Buddha nature, acknowledging the qualities that are inherent in our nature of mind once we dispel the clouds of ignorance and ego clinging and let the natural qualities of mind, such as luminosity, spaciousness, unimpeded responsiveness, or skillful means in being compassionate when we're in the presence of other beings. That's what all this would speak to. So pointing not just to taking refuge in the teachings of the historical Buddha, but tapping into something very deep that we share with the Buddha in terms of that potential for awakening. The inner Dharma, there's a lot of attention that's been paid to the relationship between the student and the teacher in Tibetan Buddhism. And I think often it's been misunderstood. The teacher is considered, there is a sense of deep faith and respect that we bring to the student-teacher relationship as students and practitioners within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I should say traditions because it is not a monolithic tradition at all. But the teacher is seen as something of a mirror reflecting the qualities that we have the potential to awaken within us. So any of us could look at somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and see his capacity for wisdom, for deep compassion, his love for sentient beings, impartial love, his love for all of humanity, all of life, and his joy and his laughter, for example, and realize that those are qualities that we have the potential to develop as well. So that would be sort of the inner dharma or inner teacher aspect of the refuges. And then finally, if we talk about the inner refuges with regard to Sangha, there's two ways that could be looked at. One is drawing inspiration from the Sangha of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and lineage masters that have gone before us, okay? And again, being inspired by their example. So that's one way to look at Sangha. And another way would be to bring that impartiality I mentioned that one can see in the life and teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, bring it into our lives. So we move beyond simply bringing the best of ourselves to our immediate family and friends, let's say, and really start to extend our capacity for compassion and wisdom to be available to all sentient beings without partiality. At least aspirationally, that's what we're hoping for. So in that sense, the Sangha of all sentient beings, the Sangha of all life. Okay? So those are the refuges. The next aspect to the ceremony is committing to bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a word that is very prominent in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And it essentially could be translated roughly as cultivating and awakening an awakened heart-mind. So as I'm sure many of you know, in Asian cultures, they don't dichotomize our feeling and emotional life and our cognitive life the way sometimes we have this dualism in the West. So we could say heart-mind together. And we make a commitment. Bodhicitta is the commitment to achieve awakening, but not just for ourselves alone. In fact, we achieve awakening so that we can be involved with bringing all other sentient beings to the same sense of freedom, of joy, that is freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering, and the happiness that comes with this freedom, and the causes of happiness. We want this not just for ourselves, but for everyone. So that is roughly what is meant by bodhicitta. The Tibetan tradition is very detailed and explicit about different types of bodhicitta. So in this bodhisattva vow ceremony, the first bodhicitta that we try and cultivate or commit to is what is called aspiration bodhicitta. Another term that you'll hear is intention bodhicitta. Several years ago, Dzogchen Ponlun Rinpoche made a visit to Connecticut. He's a highly regarded teacher in both the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And he met with a group of us, and one of the things he reminded us is, always look at your mind and ask yourself, what is my intention here? I think this resonates a little bit with some of the comments that both Jeff and John made. So our outward behaviors, for example, might be seemingly kind and compassionate, but are we perhaps doing it with some sense of an ulterior motive? Perhaps with some subtly selfish motivation? That would be one example of checking in with yourself. So there's a sense of developing a radical honesty and authenticity here in terms of what is my intention. And then more specifically, cultivating this aspiration to be of benefit to others and not just oneself. An analogy we might take would be, this is a little bit like planning a trip. This cultivating this sense of motivation, of intention, of aspiration. And before we move on to the another type of relative bodhicitta, which is bodhicitta in action, you'll also hear the term application bodhicitta or implementation bodhicitta, which is where we really commit to practice itself. Things like developing the 6 paramitas. In the Tibetan tradition, maybe committing to exploring and practicing practices such as the mind training practices of Lojong, or the specific technique of Tonglen, or sending and taking on the breath. All of that would be encompassed by this application bodhicitta. But again, you might ask, well, why even have the earlier stage of aspiration bodhicitta? And I'm reminded of the very first words in the Dhammapada by the Buddha. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. More contemporary translations of that passage might read something like this: the mind is the forerunner of all, or the mind precedes all things. So it's recognizing that in the Buddhist worldview, our motivation and intention is really, really critical. So that's why it's broken out into a sort of a step unto itself. So having made the aspiration to be of benefit for others, we then commit to the practices. And as I said, a central part of this would be to develop the paramitas of generosity, ethical virtue or development, patience, bringing energy, vigor, perseverance to the path, and then committing to meditation and insight, and then finally the wisdom of prajna. Again, I suspect many of you are familiar with the paramitas. They're shared in both the Zen and the Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And then there is yet another aspect to bodhicitta in the Tibetan tradition. They'll talk about ultimate bodhicitta, which we might just leave as, so I mentioned wisdom or insight. It's insight into emptiness, impermanence, interdependence, whatever terms you want to use, but developing that deep understanding, what Thich Nhat Hanh would talk about it as is interbeing, okay? So there's the compassion practices that tend to be associated with relative bodhicitta, and then the insight or wisdom practices, or ultimately the view we want to get to by embracing ultimate bodhicitta. And then finally, at the end of the ceremony, there is a period of rejoicing. One of the things I love about some of the teachers in the Tibetan tradition, and I think it's true of many of the monks that I've met, monks and nuns in the Vietnamese monastic tradition as well, is there is a great sense of joy, of humor, that they demonstrate in their daily lives. And, you know, commensurate with that quality, it is formally built into the ceremony that we rejoice in the opportunity to have access to these teachings and to practice with skilled teachers and communities of Dharma brothers and sisters. So what I'd like to do is just ending with a few words. This is known as Shantideva's prayer. Elena mentioned that as the year goes on, Shantideva, his Bodhisattva's way of life might be among the resources that will be studied. I'm sure many of you have heard some version of these words before. And this is a distillation of words that come early on in Shantideva's text. My Dharma sister Bobby was generous enough to share a longer 9-verse version with the Connecticut Sangha when we studied Shantideva 2 years ago. But for the sake of time, I'm going to share a shorter version. And it says this: "May I become at all times, both now and forever, a protector for those without protection, a guide for those who have lost their way, a ship for those with oceans to cross, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, a place of refuge for those who lack shelter, and a servant to all in need." And one more verse I'll share with you. This is one often quoted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He says it's his favorite verse from Shantideva, and it occurs in the final 10th chapter of the book. And that one is even more distilled, and it goes, "For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world." So I thank you for being here today and for your attention. And I look forward to whatever chatting we can do over the next few minutes. Richard, bowing out.